Wendy Capewell, a counsellor and psychotherapist. On a daily basis, I talk to people who feel they're the only ones struggling with the issues they share with me. So each of my guests have their story to share, whether it's about themselves or in their relationships, in the hope that you feel it's not just you. Moorcraft is my guest today, and she is a shaman, a sex and pleasure coach as well, which I think is really interesting. So I'm going to hand over to you, Claire, so that you could please tell us more about yourself.
Hey, I'm super excited and happy to be here today. I always love talking about pleasure and shamanism too. It's a nice mix. So I am passionate about helping high achieving, overthinking women feel absolutely amazing in their bodies, have epic sex, and feel liberation, feel freedom on all levels by releasing the shame around sexuality and opening up to receive deeper and deeper levels of infinite pleasure.
That's amazing. And I think that is it. We are so stuffy in the UK, aren't we? I think younger generations are getting better, but there is a stuffiness. We don't talk about sex. There isn't about, if I talk to clients and, enjoy sex, how do you feel about sex? And some of them get quite embarrassed about it. And yet, as one of my guests said, who is also a sex educator, she said, well, if it wasn't for sex, we wouldn't be here.
It's true, like we don't talk about this, the sexual energy, the creation energy, but we all came from this creation energy. So when the egg met the sperm, the vagina met the penis, the cock met the pussy, whatever like terminology kind of works for you. But it's true, we all came out of that. And yet it's the funniest thing, we don't talk about it. And I remember my dad saying this when I told him what I did, which I thought was quite brave. My dad's kind of like 70 and all that kind of stuff, and quite like straight-laced. And he was like, oh my God, what? This is never going to work. People are never going to talk to you about. Who would talk about that to people, other people? And I was like, but Dad, that's the thing. Like, people don't have anybody to talk to, not someone who holds like a loving, non-judgmental space. And so when they have an opportunity to talk to someone who's open about sexuality, who's free in their sexuality, who enjoys sex, they're like, honestly, I get loads of messages and loads of people contacting me, and the feedback is, wow, it's so good to have someone to talk to.
Yeah. And all those fears and worries, because where else do you take them? You can't go to your GP, it's all too clinical, and you need someone to be able to say, yeah, that's okay, or oh yeah, that maybe that's a problem, or how do you feel about that? It's just being able to say, I'm not alone, because I think it is, isn't it, that with so many things that people feel that they're the only one, or they're struggling, and where do they go? So yeah, absolutely. But we're not going to talk about that today, are we? We're going to talk about, well, I guess it may be related, because you're going to tell us your story, but we're going to talk about complex PTSD.
Yes.
So are you happy to share your story here and tell the listeners and myself a bit more about it?
Yeah, so complex PTSD, I didn't really know what it was and so till a few years ago. I think it's a relatively new kind of science, or a relatively new kind of diagnosis, and it's quite different from PTSD. So PTSD is a certain set of symptoms from like an isolated single event, like maybe a rape or something like that, or a car accident. But complex CPTSD is a little different. It's complex trauma, so it's repeated instances over and over and over again, usually from childhood abuse. So it has kind of similar symptoms to PTSD, but it's if you've got complex PTSD, you usually get all the symptoms, and it tends to be because you're not working with a single instant, it's harder to kind of remove it and undo it from the system and undo it from the body. So my kind of journey was was quite a long and sort of painful one. So I spent sort of 15 years as a successful corporate businesswoman, but I was secretly hiding an eating disorder and an exercise addiction. And because of this, I kept pushing my body. I ended up with a yoga injury, a rib injury, which disrupted my nervous system that was already overwhelmed from the PTSD that I didn't know I had. Like, my thing was like, oh, my childhood was fine. Like it was relatively happy. I went to school, I was fed and I was clothed, and we went on holiday, and I don't remember it being particularly traumatic or incidences until I started recounting it to my psychologist. And he was like, "No, that's not normal. That's like profound, severe trauma." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So it's funny,
Mm.
like how the mind is very protective and blocks things. And also the other thing is how society normalizes these things, right? They
Yeah.
tell us that, oh, if you look at the adverse child event studies that looks at how adverse events in your childhood correlates to chronic conditions, chronic diseases and illnesses later on in life. And it is quite stark, actually, the
Mm.
correlations between the two, the high instances of depression, of eating disorders, of autoimmune diseases, like all of these kind of things, of bowel problems and stuff. It's all generally, it's all been linked back to these childhood abuses. And like one of the worst ones, actually one of the most insidious ones, is being put down, being belittled, being criticized, being told you're stupid, like and you wouldn't necessarily think of that as trauma, but that's one of the severest traumas. Actually, that's one of the most impactful traumas that can happen to a child. So I thought, wow, that's really that's kind of really quite telling. um
Yeah.
So then I got a rib injury and it didn't heal, so I ended up having sort of fibromyalgia. And I was just lived in chronic pain, like I couldn't breathe, or my whole torso would lock down into spasm. I pretty much kind of survived with them.
Mm.
I didn't do anything else. I just went to work, and I was still trying to do yoga at the time, even though I was really injured and stuff. I just had that the addiction. I just couldn't stop. And it wasn't until I understood about complex PTSD that I realized that, wow, the addiction was a coping mechanism. The anorexia was a coping mechanism not to feel, just to take the edge off the heightened emotions from my nervous system. And also because before I started doing yoga, like I couldn't sleep. I had like 2 years where I just was so anxious all of the time. I just had insomnia, and it was awful. And it wasn't until I started doing Ashtanga yoga 6 days a week, I was like, oh my God, I can sleep. I don't have this like constant, like nervous leg twitch. And all of those things that I didn't realize were due to the constant fear from the complex PTSD, because my childhood was rough. Like I had
Mm.
birth trauma. So I was an incubator baby. I wasn't breastfed. My dad abandoned us when I was 5. My stepdad was very emotionally and mentally abusive. He was in the SAS, and it was literally
Yeah.
like walking on eggshells. He was
Mm.
so angry. It was just constantly terrifying. And so I didn't remember any of this until kind of later on. But like the immense levels of fear, like yoga and exercise was just my way of coping.
Yeah.
Not a very healthy way. I mean, like addictions are, you don't do an addiction because you want to be an addict. You do an addiction because you're in so much pain, like Gabor
Yeah.
Mate says. And that's not why the addiction, it's why the pain. And my psychologist, he's like, I've never met an addict who hasn't got complex PTSD. So
Yes, and I think when you were talking about your childhood, I think I always ask clients, what was your childhood like? And they go, yeah, it was normal, it was okay. And but for them it was normal because that's all they knew. And therefore that's what they understood to be normal. And as you say, the brain is very clever at just putting aside those nasty bits that would be too overwhelming. But then we get that overlay, don't we, of all the other stuff that we do to avoid that pain, but it's causing us more pain. So
yes,
yeah.
and also like that's a symptom of a complex PTSD is disrupted emotions. The physical pain I used to get, the I think because I did so much yoga before, I didn't get so much of this. So yoga moves a lot of stuff through the system if you do it properly, but the trouble is I didn't get the underlying cause treated. So it managed the symptoms, but it didn't heal
Yeah.
the underlying sort of issues. So I feel very lucky, actually, in many ways. Like spirit has directed me into a space of like, you're going to look at this, you're going to heal this, like keep, it's like almost like everything's been so perfectly orchestrated to get me to a point of like where I love my body and I'm like in a better relationship with it. All of the things that have bothered me for so long, You know, I was in therapy ever since I was 15. I was
Wow.
always I was just paid out of my own money. I was always paying for something, some form of therapy, to try and figure out what was wrong with me. I felt like so broken. I was stuck in anorexia. I self-harmed. Like, I remember at 17, like smacking myself over the head with a hairbrush. And, you know, that was
Wow.
just, yeah, it was like I hated myself. There is a part of me that wanted to destroy me. And I'm so lucky that I've got a strong spirit that I didn't destroy myself, because I took an
Mm.
overdose at 26 because the pain was just so much. And I didn't want to die. I just wanted the pain to stop. And it
Yeah.
was like that for so, so long, until I got pushed into leaving my corporate job. And I got a message from spirit,
Mm.
pretty much said, stop messing around with your job. This is not your path. Go leave London, go off and do your shamanic training. So I
Yeah.
was like, I felt the call at 26, but I was too scared to answer the call at that point. And so, you know, if you don't answer your calling, usually spirit will sledgehammer you into it. So you'll eventually kind of work your way back round to it. But
Mm.
I wasn't very good at surrendering to what life had designed for me at that point. I was still in the, like, I was too scared. I was in too much fear. I was locked in too much addiction. Um, and it wasn't
And
until,
no, that fear of the unknown as well. And I hear quite often, you know, if I open this up, what will happen? It's too scary because, you know, even crying, if I start crying, I'm scared I will never stop. If I open this box, if I start exploring, I'm scared of what's the other side. And I think, I don't know, how is that for you? Does that resonate with you at all?
oh, totally. Like, as you know, as a child, I wasn't allowed to feel anything. Like, emotions were not allowed in my family. My stepdad was
Mm.
SAS, and it was just suppression. My mum's thing. I love my mum, but she's like, smile and nod and get on with it, because that's what her mum taught her. You just get on with
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Um, and so it was terrifying. If it wasn't for the fibromyalgia, if it wasn't for that not healing, I would still be an anorexic, and I would still be an exercise addict, but I would just be functional, and I wouldn't be
Mm.
free. So it kind of forced me into looking at things that I didn't want to look at. And I did. I spent 2 years in bed, locked up in pain, not being able to breathe. Like,
Wow.
yeah, it was about level 9, 10. I don't know how I made it through the days. I guess I'm really strong
Gosh.
willed in many ways, but it was the worst time of my life. And I was still avoiding. Well, I didn't know. I just thought it was all physical. Even after my shamanic training, I was like, well, that's not work. That's a load of rubbish. You know, I was so trained by Western society. You know, I was a pharmacokineticist in the pharmaceutical industry. Then I spent sort of 15 years being a sales rep for a medical device companies. So I was on the other side of medicine. You know,
Yeah.
I've always been drawn to my jobs because I wanted in some way to help people heal. And now I get to do it myself rather than kind of through other mediums. So I almost think life was showing me ways of, like, what doesn't work, you know,
Mm.
where the holes are. So I had to go in search of, okay, well, what's really here? Like, what is healing? What is wholeness? You know, how do I heal myself? Because we were talking about this earlier. You know, I had a diagnosis, and the diagnosis for fibromyalgia is not good. They talk about managing it. It's not a condition that leaves you. And I refused to accept that. I was like, no, the body is clever. There's, you know, there's intelligence in the body. I believe healing is possible. But I resisted a diagnosis for about 6 years because I didn't want to address it. I didn't want to accept it. I didn't know what was going on. So it's a funny dynamic of not being in denial, not being in suppression, which addicts are masters at, and then also not becoming the label, not becoming the condition, not identifying with it.
Yeah.
And it's hard,
Yeah.
you know. I had fibro for 8 years, so it's really hard not to become that
Wow.
person who has that. And my whole life kind of really got sort of centered around it. But it wasn't
Mm.
really until I actually accepted what was going on, and I was going to need to go in and deal with all of the stuff that kind of happened and deal with the heightened emotions, that my life really began to shift. Because it I felt like I was living in a constant war zone. It was just like, I don't know how else to describe it, but I kind of describe it as like a white zone where I was constantly like this. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't feel my body. I, it was just, I was just a shell, a terrified
Yeah.
shell. And it was that's no way to live, you know. And I was suicidal, had suicidal ideation. I'd think about that a lot. Like, I'd be driving my car down the road and I was like, I'll just drive it into this bridge. And it was so strong, that suicidal ideation. But then I've also got another part, that, you know, my connection to source, my connection to spirit, which came back actually through my shamanic training. That was the real gift, as
Mm.
well as remembering, oh, I'm an energetic, I can work with energies, I'm really, really sensitive, I'm a highly sensitive person. And like, working in hospitals with all of those, you know, lots of those energies around, was not the best. It was not the best job for me.
No.
But yeah, yeah, it's been quite a journey for me. But I also,
Absolutely. And I wanted to kind of stop you for a moment, Rebecca, because I think you talked about different areas of your life, you know, the addiction, the fibromyalgia, the anxiety, you know, all of that stuff that was going on for you, that sensitivity. But I think, and of course your ribs and the effect that had on you as well. But I think what happens, or has been happening so much in Western medicine, the view is treat those symptoms and not acknowledging that the body and the mind are connected and one will impact on the other. And you mentioned Gabor Mate, who I follow him. I think he is really, he and a lot of his cohorts have really opened this up and getting people to understand, you know, the body talks, the body speaks. There are lots of different kind of people, Peter Levine and so on, who really have opened this up and saying, yeah, you know what? If you've suffered a trauma, whether it's physical or emotional, the two will, one is going to impact on the other. And the conversation, I remember working with one client, she was so resistant to accepting that all the things that happened to her and her emotions were related to the numerous traumas that she'd been in her life. She got so angry, she walked out. And I
I was
thought,
that person for a long time. Yeah, because it's so hard. It's so hard.
yeah,
We're so conditioned by Western society, and I always reminds me of, you know, the hero's journey, when you're about to enter the innermost cave. Like, the fear of the fear is actually worse than the fear itself. So the fear of
yes,
what's inside, you know, and I think the reason that I didn't want to go there is because I knew there was sexual trauma in my history, and I'd forgotten it. And it wasn't until I was with, it was actually Panache Desai, and I was one-on-one with him, and he was like, I'm seeing an instant. And then I saw it and I started to remember, and I was like, wow. And that was my biggest fear going in, that that would come out, and then the ramifications in my family, what that meant for me, what, and all of these kind of things. Um, so I understand how the mind and the mind, the psyche protects, right? It doesn't want us to kind of go through what we went through, and
no, absolutely not. I
it's
think it's nothing
survival,
worse
isn't
than,
it?
no, I think it's nothing worse than re-traumatizing. I mean, as you say, remembering. And if I work with anybody who's been through any kind of abuse, I make it clear, we do not talk about the trauma. We don't, unless you choose to, because we do not want you re-traumatized. And I think that is so important. It didn't used to be that, I mean, up until, gosh, I'm going to say up until probably 10, 12 years ago, the view when I was working was maybe a bit, no longer, 16 probably. It was, yeah, you have to talk through the trauma. And then I think the real, you know, in my line of work anyway, and I think there was definitely, no, hang on a minute, this isn't good. And that whole thing changed around, noticing that, of that, you know, you can't keep reliving that trauma. It's too painful,
Yes.
damaging.
Yeah, I think someone posted something really interesting that I thought was a good thing. Like, anxiety is something that you're worried about happening in the future, but for people with complex PTSD, like, the fear is the body remembering things that happened a long time ago. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really kind of, it's really true. But, you know, I think the advent of, you know, like Peter Levine, somatic experiences, in body-based practice, and that's how I found the sex and pleasure coaching, because it's an embodiment practice. I had to heal myself through my body. You know, before I was just like a head on a body, because my body was such a scary place. You know, as soon as I had sex, I would disassociate. As soon as I refused to
Yeah.
touch myself, you know, if I like, self pleasure for me was like a quick orgasm, maybe once, I don't know, every 3 or 4 months. You know, I was so kind of cut off from myself. And you know, you can't be an anorexic and an exercise addict embodied because you would be able to feel what was going on. And so,
Yeah.
like, really being able to, like, I had to go through a process of like relearning how to connect to my body in a different way. I had to learn how to create safety again in my body so I could feel at home again in my body. And I think people miss a lot of this, especially in sexuality. Like, if
Mm.
there's no safety, there is just acting from the mind. So people will have sex and do things because that's what they think they should do or should look like. And there's no
Yeah.
connection in that. That disconnects you from yourself and disconnects you from your partner, from your lover. There's no intimacy in that. And so really it's like, okay, how do I work with my own system? You know, how do I learn to find safety inside of myself where there was none before? And because of the amount of trauma that I went through, I had someone else to hold me in that, you know, to really kind of be able to work with yourself and work with your feelings, because the trauma is not the problem. It's the heightened emotion that's trapped in the system that contracts the energy field. That's the problem. And so then there needs to be enough safety in the body, enough presence, enough holding, so you can go back, and you don't have to relive the memory, but you need to feel those feelings. Those feelings need to come through you. You know, so for me, I had a lot of nausea. That was a self-hatred, self-abuse, self-harm, was nausea. I had a lot of fear. You know, my whole system would shake and go cold. I'd rage, my whole ribs and my back would be on fire and my muscles would grip solid. You know, but these things, I had to go into my body and deeply feel them and hold myself. And that's the difference. I held myself in these feelings. And when you do that, they flow through, they let go.
Yes.
But you know, until you have that capacity, like, I think you need someone else to hold that space, like the space you hold for your clients, me for mine. It's like, I am that person, I'm that presence, I'm that holding,
Yeah.
until we can empower them to do that for themselves, right? Because ultimately, this, we want our clients to be self-empowered, self-sufficient. We want them to be their own inner alchemists. Like, how do I take this pain, this poison, and transform it into something beautiful, transform it into gold, transform it into medicine that then I can gift back into the world, right?
Mm. It was coming to my mind as well that we can learn so much from the other beings we share this planet with, because they know how to allow the trauma to go through their bodies. You know, you see an animal that has been through a trauma, their whole body will tremble and shake
Yeah.
because it's getting out of their body. Literally the vibration is going out of their body, whereas we don't, we hold it,
Yes.
and because
Yeah.
it gets stuck. And
Yes, for sure.
yes, and that's what you're saying, that, you know, that was what coming into my head as we were talking. I was like, that's in a nutshell what you're talking about, is that
Yes.
you've learned how to allow that. You know, you had somebody to hold you and feel those emotions, but we're too scared to allow that to happen.
Yeah, and also for me, like, that there was blocks in the joy and in the pleasure as well. And so, you know,
Yeah.
the way that I move stuff through my system is a self pleasure practice. So for me, self pleasure is not just about orgasm. Sometimes it looks like orgasm, sometimes it looks like bliss, but sometimes it looks like crying and grief and holding my inner baby. Like, the abandonment wound has been really up for me and
Mm.
lots of my clients at the moment, and it's like that longing to be held by someone else, the pain of being abandoned by someone, and not there. But now I have the capacity to be like, oh, sweetheart, like, what do you need? Okay, just let me hold you in this. And sometimes I have to cry it through me, sometimes I scream, sometimes I dance, sometimes I lie quietly. It's just, the body is moving energy, right? The energy, the emotions that are stuck in the system, this energy wants to move, the body wants to move naturally if we allow it, if we can get the conditioning out of the way. And then, you know, I found, like, there's just so much pleasure in crying. It sounds kind of wild, but it's like, you know, opening up the definition of what pleasure, like, the whole of life is pleasure. We're here to be humans, right? We're here to have the whole experience and also be divine. Remember that we're spirit, that remember that we're God. But then also remember that we're messily humans. And as you said, we can't do this alone. We need to do this in community. I think that's really important. Like, I have a amazing community around me of like loving human beings who are on a similar journey, who are on a similar path, who understand me. And as you mentioned at the start, you know, it's so hard when you kind of like, who do you talk to when everyone else is around you going, oh, you know, I had great sex last night and stuff like that. And you're like, wow, I can't even touch myself without freezing. Like, what is wrong with me? And you
Yeah.
just like, this is what I see in lots of my clients. They just say to me, I feel so alone. I feel broken. I feel like there's something wrong with me. I don't have
Mm.
anybody to talk to. And we don't understand that these things, you know, things that, you know, you can cry during sex, you can shout, you can scream, emotions come up. You like, often, like if I have a cervical orgasm, I will cry and laugh at the same time. It's just kind of what happens. But people don't realize that that's just what happens in sex, because we have
Yeah.
a narrow definition, like by porn or society's movies standards of like,
Yeah.
this is what sex should look like. And for a lot of us, if we're not naturally wired sexually, you know, there are different ways that we're wired for eroticism. And this is the work that I do with my clients, figure out how they're wired most easily so they can learn how to turn themselves on. But there has to be a level of safety in the body first, because from safety, then turn on arises naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. And that allowing, isn't it, rather than fighting it as well, or yeah, being more comfortable with our bodies and so on. So, wow, we've covered a lot today, Claire, haven't we? But yes, thank you so much for this. There's so much in there. But I'd like to ask you, what is one tip you would like to pass on to the listeners right now?
I would, what wants to be said? I think just a reminder, reiteration, a permission slip. I find lots of my clients need permission. Like, pleasure is your birthright, bliss is your birthright, play is your birthright, ease is your birthright. So I guess it's just that reminder of all of this is available for you, should you choose to walk this path.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really good. Yes, I agree. It is, that denial, oh, I don't deserve, it's so written across people's foreheads. Oh, it's tattooed in their very being. So yeah,
Oh yeah, that was
let's
massive for
allow it.
me. Like the not deserving, and I think that's one of the imprints of the sexual trauma as well. You really kind of get, and the abandonment wound. Actually, there's very much under
Mm,
abandonment wound is, why did someone leave me? Well, because there must be something wrong with me, because there must be not good enough. You know, with the sexual trauma,
yeah,
it's like, oh, I'm bad, I'm dirty, I have done something wrong. You know, and all of these
yeah,
things. I think the most interesting thing about the sexual trauma is that it really impacts your ability to receive.
yeah,
If there's receiving issues in my clients, I start there. And sometimes the sexual trauma doesn't come through them, it comes down the generational. So it might have happened to their father or their mother or their grandmother or whatever it is, but the imprinting moves down through the system. So
and then,
it's
yeah,
fascinating. And the trouble with any form of sexual trauma is it blocks the sexual energy. And sexual energy is life force energy, it's creative energy. You know, without this energy, things don't happen. We can't create, we can't, and we age faster. You know, there's less pleasure and joy and beauty in our life. So you know, it's sexuality is a really deep area to work in, but I've also found it for myself and my clients to be the most transformative, the most rich, because if you want the most rapid, the quickest transformation or the deepest, I think you have to work in the area where there's most suppression.
yeah. Wow, thank you for that.
Thank
So what's one easy way that people can get in touch with you? Because I will put all your details in the show notes, but if somebody's listening and they just want an easy way to contact you, what's the easiest way?
The easiest way is to find me on Facebook. So I'm CLAIRE MOORCraft. So Claire Moorcraft, and then just message me. That's the easiest way to find me.
Thank you so much, Claire. That's brilliant. And
Thank you.
thank you for being a guest today. I hope you found this episode interesting as well as helpful. Do get in touch if you would like to learn more about working with me. My email address is info@wendycapewell.co.uk. Take good care of yourself. Until next time.